All right, so to begin with, then Gnosticism is actually a label for, notice, various diverse religious ideas, they tell us, right? So it wasn't one basic idea of what Gnostics believed, right? There were lots of beliefs. Actually, there were many Gnosticisms, right? Not Christianities, but Gnosticisms, right?
Yeah, even the biggest Gnostic person that's kind of most popularized it, even their group wasn't that well known.
Yeah. So they point out that the ideas really never developed into a single organized movement, right? Because the various Gnostic groups only shared a few key similarities, right? So,
also, if you keep things secret, things stay secret. Our founder died because syphilis or bad water or a donkey kicked him in the shin, and we don't have the ability to save him. Well, we're done.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
He held the keys. So most likely, because Gnostics could not agree among themselves, they never formed a church or groups of churches. They formed in small communities, and we see them come into churches and try and take over and kind of socialistically tread on the capital of the prophets. So there we go. I factored in a claim from economics there for everyone. So this lack of organization and unity within Gnosticism stands in stark contrast with Orthodoxy. And we see that growing quickly. We see it growing diverse among, again, people, types of people, groups of people. Paul and his companions, John Mark and the like,
Luke.
They go on 3 missionary journeys and make their rounds. It started out in the church in Jerusalem, but if we don't ever look at the New Testament documents, we can't ever start at the beginning. Right. We're starting too late. So the emphasis on the rule of faith, the early agreed upon set of core Christian beliefs, that's what we kind of call it. If you say kind of your creeds within church, this is kind of the what you can do in the scope of a few breaths. And so this is what the rule of faith is the early agreed upon set of core beliefs. So the emphasis on this demonstrates an early unity in Orthodox writings. And we see that especially, you have Paul going out and people are saying, oh, this guy's really hard to understand. Are we sure that he's speaking true scripture? And go to Peter, and Peter goes, I know it's sometimes hard to hear, but that's what the gospel is. It's sometimes hard to hear. And what Paul is talking about is scripture. And so Peter backs up Paul's apostleship that Jesus established.
Right. So not only was there a lack of organization in Gnosticism, and not only was there much greater organization in early Orthodox Christianity, and they held to what our authors are calling the rule of faith, which they'll get into a little more later. But also, early Orthodoxy had no official authority to suppress what they perceived to be heretical teachings, right? Right. Who was the authority, or what was the authority? I mean, you had a bunch of little churches all over, or house churches, or people dying or running or whatever, right? And so there was no real authority. It wasn't until AD 313 when Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan mandated religious toleration, right, that the Christians acquired official means to take action against heretical groups. Right. So that was, quite a few years later, right? By this time, there was no mention of Gnostics, by the way, right? So this suggests that Gnosticism was definitely refuted before Orthodoxy had any official power to do so.
Right, and we have a lot of early church fathers writing things and against different types of heresies, and we see that throughout Christianity for the next 2,000 years, minus the first 100, you have responses and people coming in and trying to add to the gospel, take away from the gospel. You have Athanasius coming in, standing up and preserving, an idea of the Trinity as biblical. All these things come much later than the first century. So the implication then for this evidence concerning Gnosticism is that if the Gnostic movement was the biggest threat to orthodoxy in the 2nd century, the sects that posed considerably less of a threat can likewise not be considered as early or well-developed as orthodoxy, right? So they just didn't have enough oomph at that point than the biggest ones, okay? So also it is patently absurd to believe that the broad Orthodox unity and organization of the 2nd century appeared almost out of nowhere, that it just arises. Right. Again, when you cut off the 1st century.
Proof is there.
I'm a church. Well, okay. I guess we'll go with that. No questions of like, what do you mean a church? What does that mean? Communion, you're eating people? You call each other brothers and sisters. These were claims that outsiders infiltrated the church and went, oh, they marry their brothers and sisters. They're cannibals, and they're atheists because they deny other gods. So, again, even the Romans didn't like atheists. So it appears kind of almost out of nowhere. The most reasonable appraisal of the evidence is that doctrinal unity had early origins, a.k.a. or i.e. Jesus and the apostles were the source of that. Right. So by contrast, it appears the heretical movements were less organized and widespread in the 2nd century because they were parasitic of orthodoxy. Again, they leached off what was already there, a la socialism. These heresies were later deviations from orthodoxy rather than equally legitimate claims to the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. And we see that. We see Paul, we see Peter, we see James pointing back to Jesus, pointing back to his teachings. We see that with the early church fathers. You can form all the words of the Old Testament or of the New Testament just by quoting early church fathers. And the fact that any of that arose, stuck, was continued, was published, was so wide known that we can collect those things. We can talk about post-Nicaea, anti-Nicaea, all these things point to the fact that orthodoxy was established early, and people were pointing back and wanting to go back to the sources. And in fact, once you get to the Reformation, the ad fontes, the back to the sources, that was, it was a contention to even claim that it never disappeared, that there was always this remnant, and the Roman Church had so diluted the message of the gospel that they were out of sync, and they were wanting to go back to what the early church fathers was, which was to reference the New Testament of the teachings, the authoritative teachings of Jesus and the apostles.
Yeah.